Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. We are back with our fifth installment of Soren Kierkegaard's Training in Christianity. Bob is our discussion leader today. Given that I am diligently working on all the other content for the Noetic platform and app that I hope all of you will delight with feverish passion in. So, Bob, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we're going to be talking about the establishment. A little later on, we'll get into the establishment. We'll be talking about the offense of Christ as well, and I think you're going to enjoy the show. This kind of takes me back to the 60s. No, not the 1860s, the 1960s, and
Bob.
It's kind of cool, you know. So I think I'm really excited about this episode. Hopefully, I'll be able to do justice to Kierkegaard here, but we'll see.
I've never not enjoyed one of our episodes, so let's get to it.
Okay. Well, this is actually part 2. This is the beginning of part 2, and it starts off with a prelude. So I'm going to read just a little bit of the prelude because this is pretty much what it's going to be about. It says, "Yea, blessed is he who is not offended in him. Blessed is he who believes that Jesus Christ lived here on earth and was the one he said he was, the lowly man, and yet God, the only begotten of the Father. Blessed is the man who knows no other to go to, but knows in every case that he may go to him." So this is the offense, and he talks about the offense now in different ways. He talks about that it takes 2 forms, but we'll get into that a little later. That's just kind of a little bit of a summary of what we're going to get to. So basically here, it is that we should believe what Jesus said he was, what Jesus taught, and what Jesus did. And it's important here to make this distinction. And he makes this distinction very clearly, that it's not just what Jesus taught, nor is it even what he did in a sense, but it's who he was that really becomes the offense. Most people can tolerate Jesus because he said nice things and they can, put nice embroideries in their home without even being a Christian, without even being devoted to this this man. So, it's interesting that how people can departmentalize Christ and just pick out what they want Christ to be, and then go with that. But I'll continue on with what he's saying here, is that we have to be afraid, or we have to be in fear of what can kill faith. Because what can kill faith can also kill Christ in us. And he calls this the offense. So what he wants to do is to make sure that we preserve the offense of Christ, which is kind of in a different direction than I think some churches can go in, or some believers can go in, is that they think the point is to try not to offend people. So let's present Christ in a very non-offensive way or unoffensive way, and we'll get more people to believe in him. And I think that has proven over the years to be true. You certainly have gotten more believers, but they are being deprived of the offense. And so Kierkegaard sees this happening in his generation, and that's what he's writing about here.
Can I try to articulate a question?
Yeah, oh yeah.
All right, so let me see if I can do this. So, you're right. This is an incredibly effective technique to get more people to be Christians in name, right? So we have these mega churches that are opening up, and the people hear these great self-help lessons and everything like that, but they don't get the real meat of the Bible. They're not offended to the point where they have sort of an existential crisis where they are going to choose the narrow gate. It's made very broad and very easy, just like getting on a train and going to New York or something like that, right? It's not this arduous journey up to the top of Mount Moriah. right? You're not working out your salvation with fear and trembling.
Good analogy. Good analogy. Yeah.
Right. So I think you and I have both done that in our own ways. I especially did that in 2017. But how do you think God, but we're not separating ourselves from these other Christians over here who have had the easier path to Christianity, right?
Right.
How do you think God is going to judge these different types of Christians? The ones that are sort of filling out the bubble on the census sheet and who go through all the motions of stately Christendom, and those of us who are just consumed with this like an obsession. I guess it's a little hard for me to see that God is going to be terribly judgmental on these baby Christians over here, these sort of nominal Christians, because I don't even know if they know how superficial their Christianity is. It's all they've ever been taught because the church has taught them to be like that. It's sort of this race to the bottom, this watering down, this dumbing down of Christian concepts. And I guess I have a hard time understanding that God's going to be super judgmental on these individuals. So what is Kierkegaard's motivations for making everyone experience Christianity like you and I have experienced, where we become sort of zealots? Like, I didn't go to church on Easter Sunday because sometimes I wonder if I'm just, and I know this sounds kind of self-righteous, like sometimes I wonder if like I'm just too religious for church. I know it's a crazy thought to even entertain. So what is the goal here?
Yeah, I think the goal here is that he's preaching. He wants to preach, and he's writing this for Christendom. And Christendom are those Christians that you're talking about. The Christians that just kind of sit back and go to church and think that everything is going to be okay because they kind of believe in Jesus, but they do the rituals, they are nice to their neighbors, they live kind of decent lives most of the time, and so they feel that everything is cool, everything is okay here. And we talk about judgment. I don't consider God to be judgmental in maybe in the same sense. I think it's more of an ontological judgment. It's a judgment of who God is and how we can appreciate God. You and I, because we've gone through this existential crisis and existential choice, and we continue to follow after it, we can appreciate the mercy and the grace of God. And this was part of Jesus' teaching. It's how do we appreciate God? So we have the capacity to appreciate the glory of God more than the people who have not gone through this crisis. And I think that's the significance here. That's how I see what Kierkegaard. Now somebody else might see it differently, but that's how I see what Kierkegaard is saying here. Is that his objective is to help Christians to appreciate the true glory and essence of God, where they cannot really appreciate it in the state that they're currently in.
So if I understand this correctly, the reason why Soren Kierkegaard wants to give existential crises to inhabitants of Christendom and those outside of it is that not so much that they can escape the judgment and wrath of God, but so that they can have a greater understanding of God's glory.
Yeah.
Do I have that right?
That's how I see it. As Jesus said, he says, I come to give you life more abundantly. I think that's what he's focusing upon. Now, there is a part of Christianity, a part of this glory that is judgmental, where Jesus talks about casting people out into outer darkness and that. And there certainly is that element. And God will have to make that decision. That's not for me. I can't make it. I don't even know how to go about deciding who belongs where. But I tend to see God as a judge, not so much as an activity of God, as pointing the finger and judging, although this is how it's portrayed. I tend to see it as a result of our refusing God, not a result of God's anger, so to speak, but more as a result of us our rejection. So our rejection that's temporal will become an eternal rejection. And I think we will suffer the consequences. So I tend to think of, I guess, thinking kind of while I'm talking here, I tend to think of God's judgment more as a consequence of what we're doing.
Right.
Then
and this would correlate, I think, to the second death before the great white throne of judgment in the Bible, right?
Yeah. We're now going to suffer the eternal consequences of what we've already started. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'll just insert something topical here. I don't know if you saw how the Pope declared that, and then kind of retracted it, and it became kind of this PR nightmare, how the Pope said that there wasn't really hell as the way that we conceive of it, that it was sort of just
I remember reading that. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to thumbnail that or whatever.
Yeah. I remember reading that. So Kierkegaard goes on. He says, Christ cannot cause us or make us offended. He's the cause, but he does not force it to happen if we decide to look the other way. So he is, in the sense that Kierkegaard is saying that Jesus causes it only an ontological cause. He causes it by his very being. But he doesn't cause it in the sense of cause and effect, like I'm going to make this happen. And I know I'm not sure if I can make that differentiation any clearer. He doesn't simply make it happen. He makes it happen as an activity or as an action, but he makes it happen merely by being who he is. And
you mean the offense he makes happen?
The offense, yeah. He doesn't offend people as an activity, so to speak, but the real offense is in who Jesus is.
Well, I think the offense happens as a combination of who Jesus is and the preperceptions of the person who is in the state of offense. Mm-hmm. Unless I have this wrong, for instance, if you have certain presuppositions about what God has to be, right? The incarnation of Jesus Christ is going to clash with that. But mm-hmm. if those prideful sort of expectations have been removed and you truly have been made like a little child, meaning that you can be teachable, which is kind of how I feel myself. Like I've had to jettison everything that I thought I believed and I have to relearn everything again. I have to become like a little child.
Yeah.
Then I don't find Jesus that offensive. I think I found Jesus more offensive when I thought I knew everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, because you're on the other side of the offense.
Right.
Yeah, you're on the other side of the offense. But the offense is there to almost like a wall that we have to break through. And once we break through it, now we see ourselves in light, in the true light. We've broken through into the light, out of the darkness. John uses the terms of darkness and light, which are very, very, very good analogies of what we go through.
It's interesting because the nature of the offense can vary just on the surface of it. It seems like the nature of the offense can vary with the person who is offended. So say for like the highly intellectual person or the person who's very learned in the Old Testament or something like that, the incarnation of Christ would just be an absurdity from a intellectual point of view. Mm-hmm. But someone who say like is a drug addict or very promiscuous or something like that may find Jesus offensive on an ethical level, on a moral level.
Yeah.
There seems like there could be multiple levels of offense, or if I understand this correctly.
Yeah.
Depending on the person who is offended, because they're not necessarily, every individual may not be experiencing the same sort of offense. There can be intellectual offense, there can be moral offense. Do I understand this correctly?
Yeah. And it's interesting when you bring this up. I was just thinking how the offense shows itself. Sometimes it shows itself as a result of mockery, or anger, or even violence, And I think this is signs of the offense working in people. So I know you've experienced that, and I have firsthand, so we know.
Yep.
So he says that God knows that no man can understand him, but God also knows how man must be saved. And this is, it seems like a very subtle sentence, and okay, just kind of read this over quickly. But this is really important to understand that God knows how we must be saved. And he's created this whole salvation program, and he's become part of the program in Christ. And he's made this so that there is no other form of salvation. This is God's answer to salvation. Right. And this is so very important to understand. When you reject Christ, you are rejecting the only way that God has given you for salvation. This isn't just rejecting some standalone theology or some guru or some Maharishi. This is rejecting the very method that God has created, the very form of salvation for mankind.
And what's so funny about man's rejection of this path towards salvation is that it's so remarkably simple in a way, right? Because it's a free gift of grace. And when you look at other potential pathways of salvation, whatever we believe salvation to be, and this is a very interesting conversation about defining that term, it's all works-based, or a lot of it's really works-based.
Yeah.
And so many people would rather have a way that they can buy the stairway to heaven than just receive God's grace. The problem is with receiving God's grace is you have to let go of the world.
Yeah.
Right. And so many of us are unprepared to let go of the world. We have so much attachment to the world.
Yeah. And
do you see it that way, or have I dramatized the difference too much?
I do see it that way. I see it. That's a big part of it. There's another part of it that we really have to be careful and tiptoe around, so to speak, is man's desire for happiness and joy. And yes, God resolves that need for us to be joyful and happy but it's different. It's not like we come to God and some God or whatever, and because we are now joyful and happy and feel this bliss, this nirvana, that we must be right. That's is a result, but it also can be the result of false teachings as well. And the difference is that I am not in it for that. Because if you read the New Testament, you find there's a lot more suffering that's in this. And it's more about bringing glory to God. That's the focus, is bringing glory to God, not joy to us. Yes, we get joy, but that's kind of a reflection and a result of what we're doing. It should not be the purpose for coming to God.
Well, I think that's why so many people are suspicious of American Christendom, is that it preaches like this pure joy sort of ministry and gospel, and that somehow if you're a suffering Christian, if you're a melancholic Christian, if you're a Christian that has decided to pick up the cross, that there's something wrong with you, that you're not doing Christianity right. And I think, like I said, if you do see all these smiles plastered on a lot of American Christians, I think a lot of people who don't have that are suspicious of it, because it does kind of look a little cult-like. You know what I'm saying?
It is cult.
But it raises this interesting question. What do you think is the best testimony to the reality of Jesus Christ entering your heart if it isn't blissed out happiness? And I think part of it has got to be this deference to God, this true humility that you speak of. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, that's kind of difficult because it's a very deep and very subtle thing. It's an endurance. I mean, if you go through the New Testament, and mostly through Paul's writings, you'll see it's not really filled with joy and bliss, and we get whatever we want, whatever we pray for. and there's no suffering. It's not like that. That's not the New Testament. That's not the gospel Jesus preaches. And Jesus warns Christians, if you follow me, you're going to have burdens. I will take your burdens from you, but you're going to suffer. And he did not lay out a very happy road. And people seem to forget that. It's not dismal. It's just we rise above those circumstances. No, we're not afraid to. We should not be afraid to suffer. And we shouldn't judge our faith or the faith of someone else based upon whether they're suffering or have everything that they want, whether they're sick. That's not how we judge people. And Jesus even taught us that.
Yeah. And we have to be careful about overemphasizing the suffering aspect of it, because that's what made people leave the church in droves to begin with, because they were always preached guilt and sin and suffering. And so when when a Nietzschean critique or a communistic critique came along and said, "Oh, look, live in the here and now," that was enough to tempt people away from the traditional forms of doing Christianity. So you're right that we shouldn't be judging it on who's suffering the most.
Yeah, and that's very well put. And we have to be careful about that. Whatever comes. We don't seek out suffering, and we really shouldn't seek out joy as though it's, one or the other. We seek the righteous life. We seek holiness, in my words, I'd say. We seek out holiness, and whatever comes with it, that's good. If it brings joy, that's wonderful. If it brings success in our life, that's wonderful too. If it brings suffering, that's wonderful too. And that's exactly what Paul says. Paul says, I learned to be poor, and I learned to be wealthy. I learned how to suffer, and I learned joy. So we have to, walk. That's evidence of true faith, is that we walk whichever way God chooses us to walk, and we're happy with it. So now he calls this, he calls the paradox of Christ, in that somehow Jesus is this form of salvation. He calls this the paradox of Christ, which we'll find out what he means by that as we go through. His superiority brought him more sorrow, because with his superiority, he would more deeply understand the situation of salvation. This is a great thought. I never really thought of it in the terms that Kierkegaard brings it out in. That we think, Jesus knew it all. He knew all what was happening. So he was more comforted, and he was, just was able to rise above it and be peaceful within and accept it. But here, Kierkegaard is saying the more superior the individual, the more sorrow it brings with it, because the more deeply they understand this situation of salvation. For Jesus to see the people rejecting him and rejecting his Father brought more sorrow into his life, because he knew the consequences that they would have to suffer because of it. And you and me, or you and I, don't really know that in the same level that Christ knew what was going on then. And this is such a great point. I've never heard that point really before put that way. I appreciate his doing that. He says that Jesus goes about seeking a relationship with the shallow, sinful man, which in truth, he says, is every individual. So he's not like a man, because he cannot be fully comprehended. He can only be believed. This brings me comfort, because sometimes we try, especially as a teacher, we try to understand Christ. And the point is, no, you can't understand him in the same way. You have to, in a sense, walk with him to really understand what he went through. We have to kind of become him. We'll talk about becoming later, but we have to become him in order to understand him. It's through faith and through belief, not through the intellect. So it's not like you can sit through a Sunday school class and say, now I got it. It doesn't work like that. You've got to walk with him to really fully, or really more fully understand what it's like to be Christ. And this is important because this is the unique thing about Jesus and the way that God goes about saving us through faith. And this is why God chooses faith. This is the means by which we're saved. And I've thought about this and meditated on that idea for years. And it's really worth doing. Why did God choose faith above everything else? Why didn't he choose intellect? Why isn't it the guy with the highest IQ gets all the wins it all, gets the greater place in the kingdom of heaven? Why doesn't it work that way?
Well, I think the biggest reason, right, is that talent is not distributed evenly amongst the population, but faith is equally difficult for every man. Mm-hmm. Or am I stealing your thunder? I mean, is that what you were going to say? I mean, that's what...
No, true. It's equally difficult and it's equally easy for every man. And
matter of fact, it's both.
Yeah, and so this is why God chooses faith. He says this is a level playing field, I think is the expression that we use. He levels the whole field. And he says, I don't care how I made you smart, Luke. Okay, I made you that way, and so don't bring that back to me as though you've done something. No. I've created.
It's a real thing. All my life, I wanted to be just like the smartest person in the room, and God was like, "Okay, how do you like it? It's not it's not fun. It's not fun."
No, it is not. It is not. Yeah.
Careful what you wish for. That's what I would say to anyone who wants to be like the blowhard know-it-all. Like when God pulls back the curtain and shows you what's going on, like be ready.
Be ready. Yeah. So faith is kind of put a little note in here. Faith is not just blind belief, which a lot of people accuse Christians of. A lot of people say, "Oh yeah, you're one of those who just go ahead and you believe what you want and that's it." But faith is believing in a promise, and it's believing in the person of Christ as being that promise. This is what I have to remind people of all the time, because even people from cultic faiths think, "Oh, I believe in this guy, you believe in Jesus." No, it's not that at all. It's not that you just pick somebody and believe in him. Jesus is an answer to a promise. We just don't believe in an individual as though it's a standalone person who spouts out poetry, and euphemisms and so forth. It's about the answer to a promise. And God promised us a Savior. And Jesus is the answer to that promise. This is what faith is for the Christian. So we can't lose track of that. To believe in Jesus isn't to believe simply that he existed as a human being, but it's to believe what he said and who he was. So the belief of a Christian, I believe, goes much deeper than the superficial, simply believing in an individual. Because he appeals to you, or because, again, he spouts out some poetry. It's not simply believing in him. This Kierkegaard goes on. It's not simply believing in him as a first century prophet, but rather that he existed in eternity. So, and this is another issue. Some people bring up certain individuals that found plates in their backyard that tell them that they're going to grow up and become a leader of a whole new Christian movement. And so people say, well, this is obviously, we put our faith in him. This is why God gave us faith to put in this particular individual. So it's no different than having faith in Jesus. We have faith in this man. But that's not what believing is. Believing not just as Jesus as an individual or even as a prophet, but rather that he existed in eternity. So when we believe in Jesus, it's not that we believe in the historical Jesus that existed from the year 4 BC to 30 BC or whatever period that was. It's not that he existed for 33 and a half years and that's it. No, it goes back to eternity. He was the Word of God, and it goes forward into eternity as the Word of God. And no individual can make that same claim. So no individual can claim that equality, that deservingness of faith, because no individual goes from eternity to eternity except for the Word of God, which is found in Christ. So that's the biggest difference. When people say that they're a prophet and we ought to believe in them, my answer is that they did not exist for eternity as did Jesus. So I can't believe someone who's merely temporal in the same way that I believe in Jesus. So when people try to get me to believe in their particular cultic faith, the question I ask, well, how long did this man live? Where did he come from? And if they can't tell me he came from eternity and he goes to eternity, then he's not on in equal footing with Jesus. Now on page 68 here of my text, we enter into what's called the purpose of this exposition in brief. So he's kind of changing horses a little bit here. He says that faith is the characteristic of Christianity, but so is the offense. A man turns either to offense or to faith. So the offense is the composite of the term of God and man as the God-man. And Kierkegaard uses this expression in many of his works, not just this work here in Training in Christianity, but he uses this in many other works, the God-man. And at first it sounds a little weird, right? It sounds a little strange, and it almost sounds paganistic, right?
Or a little bit like a comic book character.
Yeah, or perhaps a little bit of that. But this is the term he uses, and he chooses his terms very carefully. Okay, so he's not just saying, oh, let's just call him the God-man. He uses this because there's kind of an offensiveness in that term.
Yeah.
Many people think that they understand the idea of the God-man. They think that because they give it a name and they call it the Trinity, that they really actually somehow understand the God-man idea. And they do not. This has been something that is difficult for me to teach in churches. But the idea of the Trinity is kind of man's concept of this, that it makes it a little easier for people to understand and talk about God and Jesus. But it is not an understanding of the Godhead. It is merely man's giving it a word and somehow trying to make it almost like we understand it because we can speak about the Trinity. And it gives us that false sense that we really understand it. And it also gives us kind of a way to bypass the offense, which is I think what Kierkegaard is getting at here. I don't think
it presupposes that we have a clean conception of God.
Yes, it does.
And so that's to begin with, right? That we can define God. And I find that to be totally absurd to begin with, right? Like that some finite being is going to be able to fully conceptualize God. Yeah. And then we have to have a clean conception of what it means to be man. Yeah. I mean, we think we know what man is. I'm a man. But what are all the qualities of man?
Yeah.
And then you have to think about them as a synthesis. So I would wager that we would have trouble not only making those concepts fit together, but defining either side of the paradox in their totality. And that would be a problem with the comprehension of it. I just want to ask you one question and let you get back to it.
Yes.
Do you find it problematic at all that Kierkegaard speaks of the God-man rather than the God-man and spirit? He doesn't talk about it, and he's not using Trinitarian language. He's using a duality language.
It does not bother me. It does not bother me. I think that he speaks of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. He speaks of the Holy Spirit separately. And I think it's because it's a lot of it has to do with how we perceive things, and he's trying to speak to a particular perception of God, and he's not artificially trying to fuse three things together in order to make it easier for us to understand, because far be it from Kierkegaard to make anything easy. What Kierkegaard is trying to do here is to preserve the offense by speaking of him as the God-man, because those are two words that just cannot really easily fuse together. And his term God-man preserves the offense as well as the paradox. And that's why Kierkegaard, I think, is so into of this idea of paradox, because in the paradox, you maintain the individuality of both of these concepts without destroying them by blending them together. Okay, and so this is the importance of what Kierkegaard is presenting to us is not a blending and a homogeneous God, so to speak, but a God who preserves the offense in his very being. And this is beyond me to try to... Don't say, can you explain that a little bit more? Because the answer is absolutely not. I cannot.
What's wrong with you? Weren't you prepared today, Bob?
Yeah. I left my dogs ate my homework. I just simply don't know how to go beyond that. And, and the thing is, maybe what's different about me, I have no desire to go beyond that. I have no need to make it smooth so I can understand it.
Well, this is interesting. This is interesting, and I want to pick your brain psychologically about why you don't have the need to do that. Let me see if I'm going to. So, I had a big paradigm shift in the past year.
Yes.
Which will remain nameless because it's so taboo to talk about in 2018. Before this paradigm shift that I had, questions about the problem of evil and theodicy and things like that were forefront in my mind. Still is like these philosophical questions that I had to untangle as being important.
Yeah.
And then when I made this paradigm shift, which Bob knows about, I don't care anymore. I don't have to have that particular mystery solved. I've been given enough information to, oh boy, I better fear God and get it right. Like, I'll just wait till I get to the other side and be like, hey, God, like this whole evil thing, like, why did you, can you just, I'm not accusatory or anything, but can you help me understand why you made Lucifer if you knew he was going to fall and the tree of knowledge of good and evil and all this other stuff? I mean, it's not a big deal. Like, I'm really cool. I'm really glad I made it to heaven. But since we're here, could you explain that to me? Like, I'm totally okay with that, having that conversation after I die.
Yeah.
And I'll probably, number 2 on that list will probably be the Trinity. Mm-hmm. But what I've noticed is that by making this paradigm shift and taking certain possibilities away and realizing I was working in a certain closed system, certain questions didn't become as important to me. Now, I want to ask you why you have a similar sort of posture towards the Trinity, because a lot of people will say, well, why don't you have to have every aspect of Christian doctrine figured out before you can assent to being a Christian? What would you say?
Yeah, I'd say my paradigm shift came about when I did pursue philosophy, as you did, not to your level, but I have pursued it to a great level. So I stand behind my knowledge of it. But I realized, like you said, where is this getting me? It's like I'm on that treadmill and I'm running faster, and then it appears that I'm running faster, and people look at me and it looks like I'm running faster, but yet I'm still in the same place. And so the paradigm shift helped me to get off the treadmill and to be able to say, this is not about knowledge. It's about being. And that's where Kierkegaard helped me to see that. And that's why I lean towards Kierkegaard, because he's the one who really speaks about the ontological qualities of God, the qualities of being, not necessarily doing or knowing. And so for me, I want to get to be close to God. I want to get to understand him from a very personal experience. Not that God just opens up my head and pours knowledge into it. But the funny thing, Luke, is that the more I understand and the less I seek it, it seems the more I'm getting it.
That's awesome.
So, I don't know if anybody out there has the same experience, or if you're seeking the same experience, just let it go. And God gives us what we need to know, not what we want to know. And I know you're experiencing that now, Luke. There's lots of things that you want to know, but God says, you know what I want you to know. I'll let you know at the right time.
Well, let me ask you this. If, God willing, we are able to teach every single book that Kierkegaard ever did, and we have to decide, well, what should we do next?
Yeah.
And let's say we are like, you know what, we should really solve the Trinity, or we should really solve the problem of evil. What do you think Kierkegaard would think of that endeavor? Would that be a fool's errand? I mean, would it glorify God for us to do it? I mean, what if we decided to resolve those issues through the study of, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas or some other theologian?
Well, I think that for myself, that's what I tried to do. I went into the Trinity with both feet, and my whole body to try to understand it. And I've read everything I could get my hands on to try to understand it. And I think what Kierkegaard might say is, well, go ahead. It's kind of a foolhardy mission, but maybe that's the path you need to take to get there. Because you're not going to get what you think you're not going to find what you think you're going to find. But hopefully you'll find the paradox is acceptable as is. And you can't solve the paradox. You have to believe it. You have to accept it for what it is. It's a state of being. And that's the big bright light that went off for me when it comes to these kinds of subjects. It's the state of being, not the state of knowing it.
Do you remember what in particular in your study of the Trinity made you go, you know what, I'm just going to accept the paradox and give up on this and let it happen? Do you remember like when you had that moment where you're like, this is irresolvable, regardless of how hard I work at it?
It was a composite of a few things. It was the in-depth study that I did of heresy and what the church considered to be heretical. And as I read that, and I read everybody's trying to define how God is composed of three beings, three persons, not three beings, but three persons all in one and all this, as they tried to resolve it, I kept reading how futile this was for them, people of much grander minds than my own. And then I read Athanasius's explanation, and I said, how is that really any different than what anybody else said? And
doesn't it kind of get to the point where everybody's saying the same thing with just different terminology?
Yeah, and then everybody feels the need to accuse the other person of not knowing it. I thought, this is like a joke. This is laughable. If it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable.
It's an intellectual carousel.
Yeah. So I found that again. I'm not trying to be. What would be the word? Trite about this and accusative that I'm saying that there's anything wrong with these people. But I'm saying for me, when I read all that, it just made me say, you're never going to figure this out. This isn't the path that you're supposed to go down. These men have spent their whole lives going down a path that was distractive. They could have done so much more with their lives than to seek a futile idea, only to have it turn out to be heretical in the end. And so...
yeah. Quite a life's work.
Yeah. So that's that was my turnaround moment. It was a little bit elongated. It wasn't a particular moment in the way we think, but it was an experience that I finally had that I came to.
Well, I find that all really fascinating, and I find that reassuring, and hopefully other people will find that helpful as well. It's a great personal story that I think has a lot of intellectual insights. We need to wrap at 4:30, so I'm going to restrain myself as much as possible so you can get through the rest of what you want to do.
Yeah, because the best is yet to come here.
Yeah.
So, okay.
I'm going to have to put the bit in my mouth.
Okay. Such an understanding, as we spoke about earlier, leaves out the contemporaneous reality of Christ. What he's saying here, what Kierkegaard is saying here, is that some people believe in a fairy tale type of Christ, a pagan God-man. But don't make the mistake of thinking that God-man is in unity with mankind. So what he's not saying is it's not God-mankind. He's saying it's God-man. God in unity with one individual. And then he now comes back again, switches over to the other horse again. He says that the offense has two forms. And this is a little bit deeper and a little bit more difficult to grasp this idea here. He speaks about it, the two forms of loftiness and lowliness. In loftiness, it's where one is offended by the fact that an individual says he's God. He makes himself someone who's higher than he is. So this is loftiness, he calls it. And lowliness is the opposite, where God actually becomes a lowly man and he suffers like a man. And it's almost a blasphemous form of God to say that how, like Islam says, how on earth could God be on a cross? How would he let his prophet suffer on a cross like that? Unbelievable. We can't accept such a God. Okay. So in the first one, a man is speaking of himself as God. He says, I am not in the least offended in the lowliness of the man. I'm not offended because he's a lowly man, but I'm offended because this man says he's God. So this is one form of the offense. So this loftiness is found in the idea that you can possibly think that a man can be God. And in a second form, that God becomes man is weak. And because God has no power. God has the kenosis in Greek or theology it's called. The kenosis is God emptying himself to become a human being. They can't accept that possibility. In this particular side, he says this is why the God-man is the absolute paradox. And there's a childlike Christianity that has no idea of the offense or even that it exists. And I can vouch for that. There's people in my church that simply have never experienced this existential moment, this crisis in their lives, this acknowledging of the offense, that there is any offense. They're perfectly satisfied and happy with the knowledge that the church gives them. And I'm not being judgmental about them. I'm just using this as an example of Kierkegaard. In its true form, Christianity does not exist in the same manner for a child. So a child has no problem really understanding their concept of the God-man. Okay, God becomes a man. Easy to understand. But even an adult who has a childlike understanding has no explicit understanding about him. But he has this childlike fancy about God. So some people never really grow beyond this childlike concept, this unoffensive concept about the God-man. They understand Bible stories like Sunday school stories. They never grow beyond the idea of the cartoon images they have of Moses, so to speak, which is dangerous. It's a concept of lofty, holy, and pure, who is greater than all the kings, but does not have real quality of God. So man can conceive of this quasi-ontological concept of God, who cannot quite come to the idea itself, but only points to the idea. And, in the ontological argument, St. Anselm says that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. It's not actually an idea that has an end to it. It's more like pointing at something asymptotic, something that never quite reaches where it's supposed to reach. So conceptually, it may be a good argument, but it never quite gets you anywhere.
Yeah, I remember trying to teach it, and I just remember it feeling like a trap. I remember just feeling like it was an incredibly clever argument, which meant that, right, which meant to me that which shows that, let's just say it was correct. Let's say it was perfectly correct, and there are all sorts of refutations of the ontological argument for the existence of God. And you can look those up, in Kant and other individuals who have dealt with it directly.
It still goes on today too, Luke, I'll tell you. It still goes on today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I remember being like, I don't want to believe this. Which goes to show that belief is not determined by valid arguments.
Yeah.
Belief is determined by will. Mm-hmm. What you want to believe.
Yeah.
So even if the ontological argument is perfect, and there's great debate about that, whether or not you actually buy it is going to be based on what you want. And then when you have that realization that truth is a function of our desires, then I don't know. I think that may have been one of the red flags for me, that maybe philosophy was a vain endeavor to get to know God.
Yeah, it's kind of, philosophy takes the same road as mathematics, that it brings you to certain things that, like dividing by infinity. Can you really divide an integral number by infinity? Well, mathematically you can, but there's a lot of people. We have to understand this is only a theory, but in reality you can't do it.
Right.
I forgot who it was who came up with the paradoxes on that. Oh, I can't think of his name anyway.
Are you talking about Zeno?
Yeah, Zeno. Yeah, his paradoxes kind of show in reality you can't do it. Mathematically, you can. And I think the ontological argument is like that. It's a great argument, and it's something to meditate upon. I think there's a benefit to the argument, but you're not going to ever arrive at a conclusion. So
I don't know one person who's like, I learned the ontological argument and then I found God.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone give that
testimony.
Yeah,
it's convinced me there's a God. Right. So now Kierkegaard goes and he speaks about the offensive lowliness. Now, this is when God becomes man. This has to do with not Christ as Christ, but with the God-man, the offense. So we go into this section called the Exposition A, on page 71, which I have a note that I'm supposed to read this. So let me go to page 71.
Unknown caller.
Yeah. Okay.
Just take a second to pause that.
Yeah. I don't want to ruin our audio here. The possibility of offense, which has not to do with Christ as Christ, the God-man, but with him as a mere human individual who comes into collision with the established order. And this is going to be the great section here where we speak about the established order. We're not going to deal with Jesus as a divinity here, but as a mere human being, an individual, at least for a little while. To be in this stage of an individual man, one cannot claim divinity. So he's going to examine Jesus here just as a mere mortal man for a little while, and then he's going to go back again. So he's kind of developing his point here of the established order. It's just funny because when I heard this established order, it brought back the 60s to me, like I said earlier, where it was called the establishment. I know you don't, maybe you read about it.
Well, I think I'm well aware of it, right? I mean, it's all about fighting the man and these, right. And I think we have different terms for what we believe the man to be now. We may refer to it collectively.
Yeah. And I don't know what we could call it today. Society is kind of a generic.
Well, we're kind of having these conversations, right? Like we have these conversations about globalism, right? We have a lot of talk in our body politic these days about globalism and that sort of new world order.
Mm-hmm. Globalism. Okay.
Yeah.
So he asks the question, is the individual higher than the established order? Would the individual back down or claim that he's greater? So in this established order, is man greater than that, or is he less than the established order? And is he willing to stand up against the established order?
Well, it depends on the perspective, right? From the perspective of the individuals that run the order, he's nobody. But in the eyes of God, every individual is infinitely important, right? And that's part of the reason why believing in God is so dangerous to the established order, because if individuals start to understand their value in terms of God's perspective and not the order's perspective, they're harder to control.
Yeah. Now, he quotes a little bit from Matthew chapter 15, verses 10 through 12. So I'm going to read them so we have a context here. And he called the multitude and said unto them, hear and understand, not that which go into the mouth defileth a man, but that which come out of the mouth, this defiles a man. And then came his disciples and said to him, knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying? So the point of this story that Kierkegaard is relating, this biblical example, is that the Pharisees challenged Jesus' disciples because they didn't wash before they ate. They broke the customs, the religious customs of the day. And Jesus responds to them by telling them that they've set up their own set of commandments in opposition to the commandments of God, and they hold those commandments higher than they hold the commandments of God. And he gives us an example where it's called Corban, like in some biblical Bibles, you'll read the word Corban. And it's where a Jew set aside a certain gift on the altar for their parents, but it didn't allow them to access it, because it was like they were giving it to God, this amount of money. They were designating this amount for God, and so their parents had no entitlement to it. And this is what was called Corban. And if you want to read about it, you can search online, give you a more detailed idea. But it was how to avoid showing love to your parents, how to avoid how you have to take care of your parents. Well, I would, but I don't. My money is all tied up with God right now. Yeah. It was kind of the worldly way to put it. And then Jesus quotes from Isaiah chapter 29:13. He says, wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near to me with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. And then he goes on to Matthew again, back to that same chapter 15, verses 18 to 20. But those things which proceedeth out of the mouth come forth from the heart and defiles a man. And it continues to say, do not ye yet understand that whatsoever entereth in the mouth goeth into the belly, and is cast out into the draught? But these things which proceed out of the mouth, the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashen hands defileth not a man. So getting through all the old English here, the idea here, Jesus is saying it's what's in the heart that count, and the mouth speaks things that are from the heart. This is what defiles a man. Eating, touching food that is eaten with unwashed hands doesn't truly defile a man. They were symbolic of sin, but they were not real sin itself. The real sin, Jesus is saying, comes from the heart. And the important thing that Kierkegaard wants us to know is that this is what set the Pharisees off. This is what offended them. Not here because Jesus was claiming to be God, but because of what he said as a mere man. He challenged their authority. He challenged their, what Kierkegaard calls his externalism. And he tried to point them towards the inwardness of faith. And this is the same collision that we have in Christendom, which is Kierkegaard's day, Christianity du jour, Christianity of his day, which was a collision of pietism with the established order. Now, pietism, I never really liked that word, I think, because the way it was used. But pietism really means holiness, true holiness here. True pietism is the holiness collides with the established order that he's speaking about. So here the Pharisees were the established order who seek after externalism. In other words, look like you're holy. If you can't be holy, at least look like you're holy. Wear fancy clothes, go around making it look like you're fasting, and so forth. You get the idea. Pray in public, make everybody see your holiness. They place the established order above every individual. So here they place this order above the individual. And this is pure subjectivity, because Kierkegaard would say, and he didn't actually use this term, but he uses it elsewhere, the established order is an abstraction. There's no such thing as the established order. It's a concept of men, what order is. And they think we see that happening today. And actually, like the wineskins, it's tearing apart today. The established order, where is it, Luke? Where is the established order today?
Oh, don't get me going on that one, Bob. I know what you mean. I thought you
were going to bite the hook, Luke.
No. I'll say that for my appearance on Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell one day.
But Jesus and Kierkegaard say the truth is inwardness. Many men think that Christ was extraordinary and even near divine, but were offended by him as they are defended today, in my own opinion. The people are fanatically devoted to the established order. This established order is always offended when truth is presented in an inwardly fashion. So when we see the established order, it's always based upon the externals. It's not based upon what's in a man's heart, but it's based upon appearances. Okay, I think we see that in the political arena. Just to pick one, I'm not picking on them, but I think that's one where we see this outward fashion. He even speaks about Hegel, who deified this established order. The more he deified it, the more he created a relationship where the individual actually opposes God. So it's very Pharisaical, because here he takes the established order and he turns it into God, which is to create a new God, a different God. This kind of blasphemy is a projection of the established order into God. So who is God? How do we define him? He is the established order. Okay, neat, kind of like, what was it, 1984. In a sense, this is what the established order always seeks to do, to make itself divine, to become a form of idolatry. Would you agree, Luke?
Yeah, but then this raises interesting questions about the order, right?
Yes.
And is it an extension of an agent or agents? Then do we start talking about crazy, ideas such as like beast system and things of this nature, which evangelicals tend to throw around, right? And there is a sort of deification of the modern technocrat order. I think that's something that we have to worry about in our day and age, where we have certain gods of Silicon Valley and we have certain sort of promises, technological transformative processes that we can engage in this transhumanism movement. I think that's one of the big orders that we see. There are multiple orders that are going on here, but that's one of those big orders that we might have to contemplate in our modern condition.
I see it as a system of orders that they don't even need to worry about colliding with one another or conflicting one another.
Oh, they all work together.
That they all eventually are seeking the same thing, to deify themselves. So, if people worry about why there's so many different conflicting stories out there in the world, it's because they don't have to agree. That's not their point. Their point is to sell themselves as some kind of deity. And
in fact, disagreement can further the orders.
Yeah, because it polarizes people, but never brings them to the right polarity.
Divide and conquer.
Yes. And this is not new, Luke.
Oh no.
You read about political systems back to Rome, at least back to the days of Christ. You see their whole idea was to deify that system. And then we see the Holy Roman Empire. And then we see spin-offs from that. The beast is alive and well.
Babylon. It's Babylon, my friend. Babylon 2.0.
2.0. And today technology look at the internet, has become its own swirling piece of this system. I'm almost speechless because you could just go on and on to name it in our lifetime.
You know what's totally normal, Bob? You know what's totally normal in 2018?
What?
It's totally normal for there to be a female robot named Sophia who addresses the UN, is a citizen of Saudi Arabia, and I don't know, is on the cover of fashion magazines. Mm-hmm. Do not question this. Do not be alarmed. This is normal.
Yeah. It's scary. It's scary. It almost makes you feel like we're talking before. It makes you feel like you're in a movie, on the movie set. Or sooner or later, the director is going to say, "Cut! You got it wrong."
But the robot's name is Sophia. I mean, if people had any sort of biblical background and understood the origination of that name, I think they'd be flipping out.
Yeah, goddess of knowledge. Yeah. So this established order begins with the God relationship of the individual, but this order the true order must be destroyed if the established order is to be deified, or rather take the place of God in the relationship. And this creates a revolt against God. Now, there's different ways of destroying the order, right? I mean, we could talk, this is an interesting subject. How do we destroy the true order? The order of God.
Oh, the order of God?
Yeah. How do we destroy that in order to replace it with the established order? We can imitate it. We can merge it. We can homogenize it with this movement, nullify it, right, by taking away all the things that make it the true order, and make them feel like they're part of this wonderful, loving world order. So we're embracing Christianity into our order. But you've got to set these components aside because that offends us. We cannot have the God-man, and we cannot have the resurrection in this new order. So you get rid of that, and we'll bring love and peace and all the other things you want. We'll bring that into this new order, right?
Yeah, 1,000 points of light, Bob. Yeah.
Yes. So the idea of making this established order divine makes it seem like man has established and obtained something. But according to Kierkegaard, it's necessary that fear and trembling take place in the individual. For this is the process of becoming, in quotes. Man becoming. This is another word I love to use because he's opened my eyes to this idea. We talk about the ontological concept of existence. This is what really has focused me. It's about becoming, not about knowing. Who do we become? Who are we? And where are we going? These are the questions we really need to ask. But these are internal questions. And this distracts us from the external questions of how important are you? How famous are you? How wealthy are you? Those are seeking after the external things. We should become aware of the process of becoming if we really are to become a true individual. So Judaism during the time of Christ had become something of a self-complacent and a self-deified establishment. They eliminated anything that could bring truth to them because it offended them. This truth became their truth, became the established order, and it no longer meant that one would suffer, but rather, if one was in truth, they would be in complete congruence with this external order, with this established order. And in this way, they would be respected and honored in the world because the world has now become God. So this is so prevalent today and so dangerous today that people's feeling that they need to somehow merge their Christianity with this new world order, you have to become what he calls congruent with the established order. You have to fit in.
And what Kierkegaard says, the moment we do that, that's when Christianity is dead.
That's when it's dead. Exactly.
Right. Because Christianity is not about a political conquest.
And people, and people don't realize that this established order is idolatry. It's a replacement for God. It is not an embracing of God, but a replacing of God. The established order that's produced by some even preachers and philosophers can create a different kingdom than the one that Christ preached. It becomes their own deified order in the same way that the Pharisees did it. So the Pharisaical idea is not just something that, oh, that's a Jewish way of thinking. It's also a Christendom way of thinking. It's a Christendom way of thinking.
Think about how many terrible things that idea has fueled, right? Everything. I mean, that's sort of dominionism, right?
Right.
I don't want to hit too many landmines here, but just think about that mindset and what that could sort of encourage. Do you think, let's just say there was like 100% total, authentic Christian conversion in the world. Do you think there'd be any need for government? Or do you think there's any political system that would fit well with Christianity in your estimation?
Well, in thinking about it as an end point, I would say a kingdom, a king, with Christ as the king, is the order that we're supposed to be working towards. So all of these other orders are merely to keep people in line. And as Paul says, they're not bad in the idea that they carry the sword. They keep crimes, hopefully crimes down and protect even the Christians from crime and so forth. So it's a necessary thing that we have some kind of political order. But we cannot look at that political order as an end in itself and as something that is, what we say, it may be authorized, so to speak, by God, but it is not divine in its order.
Right.
So this is the problem with divine right ruling by kings in the previous decades that we had, previous centuries that we had, where kings made the logical connection. Well, if God authorized authority and I'm the ultimate authority, that must give me divine right. That's an illogical premise, or maybe not illogical, but that is not a true conclusion based upon those premises. Right. So they were kings, and they were kings for a reason, and God gave them a sword that they should deal with the world properly, but he did not make them divine, nor did he make their kingdoms divine. That's Christ's rule and Christ's kingdom alone. So we see it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. I hate to say this, but I have to run. So would you like to say anything in conclusion, and we can save the next little bit for next time?
Yeah, let's save the rest because I think we get more into this established order thing. And I think this is really, really important for us today to think about what Kierkegaard said, almost like he had an eye into the future. Isn't it interesting?
Well, you don't really need to be a clairvoyant to have an eye into the future. You just need to read the Bible. It's all that. It's all there. It's not. If you read the Bible and study it a great deal, you know what's coming. You just may not know when. You know.
But it makes you look for this. Another. This is the importance, I think, of reading Scripture. Is it gives you, just like you said, it gives you the insight to look and see things where you might not have seen them before. You don't see something different, but you just see it in a different way.
Right. No, it doesn't allow you to predict it and call your shot. And I don't know if I have a perfect sort of one. I certainly don't have a perfect. I'm going to say this. I don't know. If I have a perfect one-to-one correlation and able to foresee future events, but there might be things that are materializing right now in our reality. We spoke earlier about this android, right? That's looking like a real good candidate for this talking statue that may be the image of the beast, or at least a precursor of it. Who knows? I don't know, but it seems to be pretty close. We'll see. Only time will tell. So that sounded probably pretty radical and out there. Whatever. Well, I would say we have given people a lot to think about. We talked about some pretty deep stuff in this session, even though we didn't get to finish your lesson. But I think this is probably enough for people to digest between now and next time. Don't you think? We covered a lot.
Yeah. I think they'll need a spiritual Alka-Seltzer after this one to help them digest it. So.
All right, good. All right. Thank you so much, Bob, for leading our discussion today. Hopefully my interjections weren't too problematic and you enjoyed them. And I'll have the audio for this edited and on the Noetic website and app and SoundCloud and YouTube and everything else later this evening. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.